Welcome to your Daily Detroit for Monday, August 5th, 2019. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. One of the most consequential and controversial figures in local politics died over the weekend.
L. Brooks Patterson was one of those people who you either loved or hated. The charismatic 7-term Oakland County executive and former Oakland County prosecutor died at his home near Clarkston on Saturday. He had been battling pancreatic cancer. Patterson was 80. So this will be a longer episode of the show than usual for a big topic. Funnily enough, one of our listeners said on Twitter yesterday that he loves when we go long, Sven. So Philippe, this show's for you.
And it's brought to you in part by Milo.agency. Milo is a marketing agency that produces amazing experiences for audiences. They partner with their clients to drive business and create innovative content. You can do cool stuff with them at Milo.agency.
Also, thanks to Repurpose. That's where you can get hired by Detroit's best startups and companies. Repurpose connects top talent like you with purpose-driven companies based on values, experience, and culture fit. Join their talent community at repurpose.co. That's repurpose.co. All right, on to our conversations.
Joining us on the line is a man I used to speak with many years ago, back when I was covering politics at the Oakland Press. Jim Runstad is a state senator from White Lake. He's a Republican who represents the 15th State Senate District. He's also a former state representative and an Oakland County commissioner. Jim, thanks for joining us on Daily Detroit.
Absolutely, Sven. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, good to hear from you again after all these years. It was about 15 years ago and before you had ever even declared for public office of any kind.
Yeah, that's quite a while ago since we talked.
Yep. All right. So, Jim, you served 6 years on the Oakland County Board of Commissioners before you moved up to Lansing. You know, at the time, the Republicans were in solid control of the county commission. Just last year, after the last election, it flipped over to the Democrats for the first time in decades, but, you know, solidly in GOP control back then. What was it like being a member of the same political party as Brooks to work with him? I mean, can you talk a little bit about his style?
He was a very interesting and enjoyable person to work with him in the position as county executive because he had a great sense of humor. So anytime he would come and talk to the commissioners, he always had some hilarious quip that brought down the house. And he was also extremely competent and knowledgeable. And so when he came in and talked with us, there was always good information that he was dispensing. And he made sure that everything that we did, we had the right resources to get to the right answers in terms of what we were putting together, but also help from departments. He knew how to select excellent individuals in leadership around him. And the entire time I was there was never one time that anything blew up in our face. There was never a time that we passed something and then, oh my gosh, you know, there's a scandal associated with this, or there's this waste, or this corruption or embezzlement. You felt so good with the individuals that he had selected in leadership positions that when they came in and talked to us, when they testified before committee, they were always competent and they were always truthful. I had never had the experience ever of having one of these department heads or deputy executives or anyone in leadership who came in and misled us or lied to us. They were straight up and we could rely on what they said. So It was just a wonderful experience.
Brooks Patterson was 7 terms as county executive, which is sort of hard to imagine. And, you know, you suspect that that might never happen again in the modern era. But during all that time in office, what do you consider to be his biggest achievements?
The formation of Automation Alley, Medical Main Street. He was also instrumental in working with the other local communities in Oakland County to design programs that would save them money and they could utilize the county's resources to expand their business communities, such as the one-stop shop. We also set up a cloud computing that they could take advantage of for far less cost. So those were just some of the programs that he put in place. But also, even further back, Oakland County was one of the very first communities in the United States, municipalities, that got rid of the defined pension plan and moved to a defined contribution, like a 401k or IRA. And that was back in, I think, 1994. And there's so many communities that never made that transition and now have unfunded obligations that, as time goes on, are really going to cause them some problems, perhaps put them in bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
And Oakland County has no unfunded obligations. We have funded all the obligations. And that was due to Brooks's vision going all the way back to 1994.
Of course, his legacy is a complicated one. You know, he's had a lot of controversial comments over the years about the city of Detroit. There was, of course, his long-running feud with Coleman Young, the former longtime mayor. And, you know, what many people say was like this unwillingness to be a team player and kind of be, you know, a regional leader. Do you think he was divisive? Is that fair?
I would say both. Coleman Young, who also had his way of saying things that caused a lot of controversy. There was two very larger-than-life individuals that had very big egos and were clashing on the interests they saw for, in Coleman Young's case, the city. But his view was that if it doesn't harm Oakland County and it helps Detroit or anywhere else, he will support it. But if it's harmful to Oakland County, then he is not going to support it. Mm-hmm. And so I think in terms of wherever he saw us being able to help communities, any of the communities, we were going to do it unless it was harmful to Oakland County. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a very prudent way to approach things, because if you don't keep control of things and you just regionalize programs without a lot of protection in place, all of a sudden you could be outvoted on committees, and there could be incredible damage done to your community if you don't have individuals who really are watching the bottom line. So anything that he did, whether it was the zoo, whether it was the DIA, the regional water, we tried to make sure that we had a veto power over some of the extravagant spending and things like that would have occurred if Oakland County did not have those kinds of protections. So he was always worried to make sure that he was protecting the interests of Oakland County, and I think he did that fabulously well. Just caused a very, very productive, prosperous county, and a very low crime and a great place to live. And that was due to his foresight. Whenever he was looking at anything, he was going to make sure our Oakland County was not harmed.
Times changed a lot over his tenure. I mean, he was in office for so long. The county kind of became steadily more Democratic voting just due to demographics and everything. I mean, the top office seats in Oakland County are now held by Democrats. I mentioned the county commission swinging over to the Democratic side. We've also seen in more recent years some of the economic development momentum kind of shift from the traditional Oakland County centers into the city of Detroit. And I'm wondering, I sometimes got the sense that Brooks struggled with that a little bit. What are your thoughts about that?
That's certainly true in both cases, in terms of, as he described, and it's true, that there are individuals who are fleeing Wayne County and other places where they are not fiscally responsible, and they have lots of legacy costs that are now starting to strangle their general budgets and affecting services. And so they want to get out of those areas. So they move to a place like Oakland County with low taxes, great services. And fortunately, they have made that transition. That there's a reason for that. It's fiscal responsibility of the government, of the office holders. And to ensure that that continues, you've got to ensure you get individuals in there who are very conservative with the taxpayer dollars. And that wasn't always the case. Some people come in here and they had a Democrat voting pattern from Wayne County, and they just continued that when they came into Oakland. And it has made a big impact on the voting demographics here. In terms of Detroit's expanding. That's wonderful. It's great that they're doing well. Sometimes they take some businesses from Oakland County, but I think everyone.
But in fairness, I mean, Oakland County benefited from Detroit's loss for decades.
Oh, sure, absolutely, and it was due to policies, tax policies, that were causing companies to leave Detroit, and I think Duggan has done a good job of reversing some of that and really getting companies to move back to Detroit. But time will tell whether that reverses again. We suffer a downturn in the economy, and if Detroit begins ramping up tax and regulation to such a degree that these companies are negatively impacted, they may even end up coming back to Oakland County. This is not the end of the story. We just don't know how things are going to end when the economy gets tight, which at some point it will do.
Sure. So you're talking a lot about like a very technocratic leader. I mean, I think, that it's fair to say that he was sort of a master tactician and technocrat, very sound financial management and everything. Brooks Patterson was never really all that interested in a lot of the social issues that a lot of Republicans champion. What sort of legacy do you think he leaves among Republicans in Michigan?
Oakland County is a more moderate county on the social issues, and other parts of the state, that's certainly not the case. So he was kind of mirroring I think the philosophy here in Oakland County, which was more of a moderate social policy. And then with the fiscal side of things, when you were talking about him being a kind of a technocrat, you couldn't be more correct. There were things that when I became a commissioner and I learned how the county operated, I was just absolutely amazed at how forward thinking it was. And as some of the examples of that is when we went through that contraction in 7, 8, 9, we knew we were going to have to make budget cuts. So Brooks told each of the heads of the departments that they are going to make the decisions on the cuts, that we're not going to have Brooks or the county commissioners do it. It didn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, you're going to make the decisions. And I think that really was a smart move because it got more buy-in from both sides of the aisle in terms of how to make these cuts that were necessary to be made. Another thing that he did is if you spent your money for that year's budget or you saved money, you weren't going to lose the next year's budget. So in other words, what I've heard since my dad was a principal is whatever you're allocated, spend it all. Even if you had to buy pens and papers and everything had to be spent, or the next year you were going to get cut. What you result in then is a lot of waste. And what Brooks said is, no, if you save money on your budget this year because you were really fiscally responsible, we're going to give you the same dollar amount next year, so you don't have to worry about just spending every dollar. And that was such a great concept that encouraged everyone to look for efficiencies, encourage them to cut their budgets. And that's just some examples of what he did that were spectacular in terms of administrating a county budget.
It remains to be seen how his, succession is handled here. The County Board of Commissioners has a say in that. But what does his passing mean, do you think, for governance of Oakland County?
Well, it's a gigantic hole, his passing, in terms of all of us certainly on the Republican side of the equation, that we're going to have to regroup. He was the leader in many respects. And there's a lot of very talented individuals in Oakland County and the Republican Party that we will be gathering and having some discussions about the memory and legacy of Brooks, but also what are we going to do in terms of upcoming leadership and farm teams and elections and all of that. So it will be an ongoing discussion that will start pretty quickly after we go through Brooks's funeral and all those types of things.
State Senator Jim Runstad is a Republican from White Lake, a former member of my old Rolodex back when those were a thing on my desk at the Oakland Press. Senator Runstad, thanks so much for talking with us again today.
Thank you, Sven. Always great to talk to you.
Joining us on the line is Steve Huber. In addition to being a former coworker of yours truly at the Oakland Press, Steve now is the Marketing and Communications Officer for Oakland County in the County Executive's Office. Steve, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thanks so much, Sven.
So, Steve, you started covering Brooks Patterson at the Oakland Press back when he was still prosecutor. I'm wondering, what was he like back then? And, you were there long enough to see him eventually become county executive. Did he change at all when he became kind of the leader of the county?
As a reporter, he was a delight to cover, and you would know this too. He granted reporters incredible access. He always returned phone calls. He was always accessible, and he always said quotable stuff. And as a reporter, you couldn't ask for anything more than that.
Right. He was a very funny guy, too.
He was very funny. And in my job with the county, occasionally I would write talking points for him or other things like that. And people would ask me if I wrote his jokes. And I'd say, nope, I can't touch those. Not that he wouldn't allow it, but he's just funnier than everybody else.
A lot of people are familiar with what, his style as county executive, but what was he like as a prosecutor? I mean, what were his sort of priorities?
Most folks knew him as a no-nonsense, no plea bargain prosecutor. And he, in fact, started in the prosecutor's office as a young attorney and was fired because he went against the prosecutor at the time, Tom Plunkett. And Brooks got into a hassle with Plunkett over his plea bargaining policy. And Brooks did not take kindly to any kind of plea bargains. He was an incredibly tough guy. I recall seeing him in court one time, and it's unusual for for the elected prosecutor to actually prosecute cases. But I saw him in action in court in a murder case with some guy who was a carnival worker who had killed the parents of like a high person at Notre Dame University. And Brooks got a first-degree murder conviction on him, and that was it. He referred to the guy as the mutant from the Midway.
You went from, covering him in the prosecutor's office, and then you, as I mentioned, you were still at the Oakland Press after he became county executive. And then you went into a job working in communications for Brooks Patterson. What was that like? Was that at all awkward to make that transition? And what was he like as a boss?
I don't think it was too awkward. The pace was not exactly what it was in the newspaper business, where you start from scratch every day and come up with a product. So
Right.
It was a little less intense, but working for him was a challenge because he was always thinking of new things. And it was not uncommon for him to be on vacation, and you'd get an email in the middle of the night, have you thought about doing this, or maybe we should do this, or something like that. And it was like, dude, take a rest. Give your staff a rest too. But as a boss, he was delightful to work for. I was lucky enough to have access to him, and it happened as a reporter, and it happened here too. And he'd say something that might be a bit incendiary,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd write it down and say, "Do you want to say that?" And he'd say, "What did I say?" And he'd say, "Read it back to me," and I'd read it back, and he'd say, "Yep, okay, just checking."
Do you think, had he slowed down in recent years? I mean, he had that bad car accident in 2012, left him using a wheelchair. I mean, obviously, it literally slowed him down in the sense he was in a wheelchair, but did it affect his momentum politically or, from a leadership style, do you think?
I don't think so. The only time that he really slowed down was when the cancer hit, because before that, he had just incredible energy, and it was amazing to those of us who worked with him that he was able to change gears so quickly. He was in demand all the time. He made public appearances virtually every day and would go from one place to the next, and these are different audiences, and would still talk about different stuff. And it's like, how do you keep all this stuff straight? But he would go from morning to night, and his vitality was really something. I mean, the car accident should have killed him, and it didn't. And when he came back, as soon as he got his strength back, it was business as usual. And I was just amazed that he was able to do that. And people forget when he had the accident, he was up for re-election. And so he ran for re-election. We didn't have a candidate.
Mm.
We didn't have anybody to put out there. But on the strength of his record, he was still reelected.
Any favorite stories, or just favorite Brooks Patterson moments from back when you were a reporter covering the prosecutor's office, Steve?
Way to put me on the spot. One of the things that I can tell you about him, though, he was a really compassionate people, and some folks are critical of him for statements he's made and things of that nature. And I have to tell you, as someone who was working for him, and occasionally he would say stuff, and it's like, oh, no, please don't. But he would say things, and occasionally he regretted what he said. Other times he said it for effect. But I put on a concert in my mother's memory. She was a musician, and I was able to get grants and had top-flight musicians come in. And I did this 4 or 5 times, and Brooks came to those. And he took time out of his schedule to show up, and these were in Grand Blanc. And he didn't have to do that, but he cared about his employees and he cared about people's lives. And I felt honored that he was there, and I always felt honored to work for him.
Do you guys have any plans to commemorate him up at the county offices on Telegraph there?
There is a public visitation which will take place tomorrow, Tuesday, from 1 to 7. And then the funeral is Thursday, the 15th, at Woodside Bible Church in Troy. There is also a visitation at that church the day before. If you go to oakgov.com, I'm sure you can see the information on that, or it's in all of the newspapers, and it's been broadcast on TV too.
You guys doing anything like the employees? Like, are you going to knock back, his favorite scotch or something like that?
I'm not. I think people will support him in their own way. One of the things that we had done for him during this cancer bout is came up with purple T-shirts, and purple is the color that's affiliated or associated with pancreatic cancer. And people who have had cancer, and I speak from experience, know that you don't go through an experience like this alone. You need to have support from other folks. And so we had T-shirts made that said, "Family doesn't fight alone." And it said Team Brooks, hashtag Team Brooks. And on the back of the shirts, they said, "Kick pancreatic's ass." And he enjoyed those, and we surprised him with that one day when he was in. He continued to come into the office when he could. While he was sick, he made public appearances when he could. I last saw him here 3 weeks ago, and he was still vibrant and still interested in what you were doing and still doing the work of the people.
Steve Huber is a former reporter who covered Brooks Patterson as prosecutor, and he worked for him as marketing communications officer for Oakland County. Steve, thanks so much for coming on Daily Detroit.
Happy to do it, Sven.
Phew. Big news, Sven. We've both spent time covering him, dealing with him, you for a longer time.
That's right. So as I mentioned in those interviews, I used to work at the Oakland Press. This was about 15 years ago. I didn't cover Oakland County executive specifically, but I covered politics among a couple other things and always had opportunities to interview Brooks over the years. And frankly, I got to agree with both of our guests. He was hard. He was a hard person not to like. He was very funny. He was always happy to give you an interview. I was always amazed because you could call his office, and unless he was in a meeting or something, he would always pick up the phone and give you an interview. And sometimes if the story was big enough and he was in an interview, he would, duck out to go in the hall and give you a call back, whatever. I had, known a little bit about some of his controversial background, mostly around his, really contentious relationship with former Detroit Mayor Coleman A. I didn't know quite as much about the whole busing and school integration, work that he did representing, the opponents of those things back in the 70s. Found out a little bit more of those later on. But in retrospect, I think I sort of intersected with Brooks Patterson during a moderate phase of his career. Moderate politically, He was a self-described moderate Republican in those days. He always sort of joked that he was one of a dying breed, of moderate Republicans. And he used to decry what he called at the time the Taliban wing of the Republican Party, especially some of the social conservatives that were sort of coming to prominence and, single issue, bashing gay people or abortion or whatever.
I don't think he could have held on to Oakland County as long as he did without being a bit more, I don't want to say liberal, but a bit more tolerant than a lot of other people in his party.
Absolutely. One of the things about Brooks that was clear, though, even at that time, was that he championed sprawl, right? I love suburban sprawl. I can't get enough of it, he used to say. I think that's something that's not going to age well and will, prove to end up, it's going to cost Oakland County and the state, frankly. We keep building all these roads that we can't pay for, right?
It's part of the reason why fixing the damn roads is so hard to do, because we have the same amount of people for so much more land, and we built so many more roads, infrastructure, and that's what, is sprawl, right? The same amount of people, but farther apart.
Right. He also did more than probably anybody, I would argue, to demonize Coleman Young among white people. You can still, to this day, hear a certain generation of white people in the suburbs who just think that Coleman Young was the reason Detroit has as many problems as it does today, which is just patently untrue. It's just laughable.
And that often misquoted line about, the hit 8 Mile and all that kind of stuff. He wasn't talking about regular residents or white people. He was talking about, ne'er-do-wells and criminals, that they should hit 8 Mile. But a lot of white folks took that internally and they heard it the way that they wanted to hear it, which I think...
Egged on in large part by Brooks.
Well, exactly. And I think, though, that is a precursor to the political climate we see today, because people hear what they want to hear out of whatever anyone says.
And then, of course, no eulogy postmortem of Brooks Patterson would be complete without the quote that he gave to the New Yorker back in 2014.
Yeah, that one, I remember hearing it for the first time. I was working at the Detroit Regional News Hub at the time, working with reporters telling the Detroit story, and I just was shocked when I heard it. I made a prediction a long time ago, and it's come to pass. I said, what we're going to do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation where we herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and throw in the blankets and corn.
Yeah, which was just kind of shocking. I mean, I obviously had known Brooks Patterson for a long time, and I was even shocked to read that. It was just, oh my God, like he said that, in an interview with a national publication. It was just frankly shocking. And I mean, I can't forget too that normally the convention among politicians is don't speak ill of the dead, especially before they, the body is cold or whatever. But I mean, he was kicking dirt on Coleman Young's grave the day that he died. Like, that was pretty shocking. I don't know what Coleman Young ever did to earn Brooks Patterson's ire, but man, like,
in one of the interviews, I think that it kind of was a clue that they were both men with very large egos, very strong beliefs on how to get things done. And those beliefs were, they didn't intersect too often.
Right. So, I mean, Brooks Patterson, like, there's no doubt that he was a great people manager, as we've heard. He was a brilliant financial steward, financial manager. He was a technocrat, and he had some really good ideas, frankly. I mean, like, getting Mandarin taught in more schools in Oakland County is brilliant.
3-year rolling budgets. That's a great thing that more governments need to do.
For sure. Free wireless blanketing Oakland County. Now, that never came to pass for a variety of reasons.
It would have been very exciting if it did happen.
It was a great idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, he had some great ideas. I think he had lots of good energy over time, but definitely had his faults. And I think the race issue is something that, maybe we didn't hit on enough, but there was definitely some tension there.
The modern world kind of passed him by in some cases in those later years. I mean, his county changed underneath him, and I think people changed and their tolerances changed. One of the things about Brooks that I realized covering him, and I mean, I've had a very sharp pen about him over the years, is that, he's a complicated man. And when I think about it, and this isn't to excuse the comments that he's made, but he's made comments that I've heard by a ton of people. Brooks was just publicly willing to say things that a lot of people privately said and still say to this day.
Yep. Jerry, you, as you've said on many times on this show, you were an old regular at Nancy Whiskey's, and you were telling me a story I had not heard before about Brooks Patterson and Nancy Whiskey's.
Well, not just Nancy's, but a few bars downtown, especially around St. Patrick's Day. He loved to get a group of people together and head downtown. I was never a direct participant in this, more of a viewer of this.
It's the first time, frankly, I've ever heard of Brooks Patterson going to the Detroit voluntarily.
Well, there actually is an interview in the podcast Detroit Archive somewhere of him at Nancy Whiskey's, like with microphones and everything. But anyway, he was somebody who people were attracted to him of all races. It wasn't like his crew was all white or all this. And when he arrived places, people just wanted to be around him. He was a magnetic man that had a unique charisma that you don't see very often in local politics. And I think that if not for some of the statements that he made, he could have gone much higher up in office. But then I also think then he wouldn't have been who he was.
Somebody mentioned his humor. I mean, we talked about that with Steve Huber and stuff. I certainly heard him crack a lot of jokes. I mean, if you ever listen to his State of the County addresses that he would give every year, he would basically start those every year with a joke. I mean, I often thought, in all seriousness, like he could possibly have been a comedian in another life, like a stand-up comedian, because that guy was funny and he was quick-witted.
And he elicited reactions out of people. I mean, he is one of the few people that I have dealt with that was either vehemently loved or vehemently hated. I mean, I looked at my Facebook feed and social media, and it really was like you were reading the reactions of two completely different people. He's somebody who reflects the complications in all of us and in our region. We run from the fact, and this isn't popular to say, but in the spirit of L. Brooks and saying what he thought, we have so many wounds around racism in our region that we do not deal with. And that's the thing. Politicians are reflections of us. L. Brooks Patterson, he could have been your uncle. He could have been any of those folks, because all those people still exist. All of that is still part and parcel of our region. The comment about the corn and the other comments he's made, they're still alive today. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice to point all of this on one man when I think, and this is a reflection of my own work over the years, we need to do more work in healing as a region, because he wasn't the lone. He was somebody who made comments that a lot of people have made.
Yeah, just like Coleman Young wasn't the reason that white people fled Detroit. That started a long time before Coleman Young got in office. But anyway, I digress about that. So let's talk a little bit about the future of Oakland County politics. It's about to get really interesting here. So Patterson's deputy, Gerald Poisson, took the oath and is serving as county executive right now. According to the FREEP, the County Board of Commissioners now has a choice to make. It can either act within 30 days to approve a successor to Patterson to serve out the remainder of his term, or it can set a special election. Now, as previously mentioned, the Board of Commissioners is narrowly controlled by Democrats. It's the first time in over 40 years. One member, former state rep David Woodward, had already declared his interest in running against Patterson as a Democrat, but he'd have to step down from the county commission in order to be appointed. Doing that, however, would leave the commission deadlocked with 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats. So, Jared, there could be a major battle over who replaces him. And this is, as I mentioned to Jim Runstad, the county's been trending Democrat for decades now. And this is going to get really interesting to see what happens from here.
For sure. The southern portion has changed a lot in the generation since Brooks took office. It is definitely more urban. It's more cosmopolitan. It's more diverse.
More pro-transit. One thing we talked about is Brooks hated buses of all kinds.
We've been on the Brooks bus all day, but Brooks hated buses. Man, try to say that 10 times, fans. But so here's the thing about this that I feel like is going to happen. I got to imagine some Democratic Party boss has got to take these two guys, Meisner and Woodward, into a room.
Andy Meisner, the county treasurer,
which we've had on our show before, right. And I'm sure we'll have him. And it'd be great to have Dave on the show as well too, because they're both, regardless, going to run for this office in the future. But I feel like this is the kind of deal where it's like, okay, guys, what do we need to do here? What do we need to do for the greater good of the party to make this happen? Because this infight will cause a rift and be something that will bleed over into the 2020 campaign for Democrats and Republicans who still want to hold on to this pretty badly.
No, they're going to contest this tooth and nail.
Oh, money's going to be spent. This is a high district for fun. This is a high area for fundraising. This is the heart of, you think about the Bloomfield townships, Detroit, all this stuff. You got a lot of people with a lot of money on both sides, frankly, in this area, and it'll be a Trump battleground. So 2020 is going to be something to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely the end of an era with the passing of L. Brooks Patterson. No question about it.
All right, that'll do it for today's Daily Detroit. Be sure to tell a friend about the podcast. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you download your favorite shows.
For Randy Walker and Cheyenne Nosarini, I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.